Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining me here today. Good morning. I'm still getting used to the microphone, so if I'm leaning towards it, it's not intentional. I want to let you know this session is being recorded for those that can't attend in person, so I just want you to be aware of that. And I'd like to start with a couple of disclaimers. This is an ugly subject, and there's no way around that. Unfortunately, it's a necessary one. There's no gruesome pictures or videos in the presentation. I'd just like to get that up front. Also, this is designed to be presented to a lot of different audiences that work in a lot of different places, churches, schools, cities like this. So some of it will apply and some of it may not, and that's okay, because nobody is pretending that this is the way. This is a way, that some of this stuff may help you. My intent is that you'll learn something that'll make you feel a little safer, a little better prepared, and you'll be able to apply it to your specific circumstances. But again, not all of it will be applicable, again, because it's the target audience is actually pretty broad. So I think that's about it. If you have questions that you feel like you need to answer or ask right at the beginning, feel free. There's a decent chance if you're wondering somebody else is. But we are also going to do like a Q&A portion at the end if you want to wait till then. So we'll go ahead and get started. A little bit about myself. So my name is Bo Collins. I've worked for the police department about 10 and a half years. My primary job is I'm a patrol sergeant for one of our swing shifts. I wear a lot of hats at the department. I teach active shooter response, both to non-commissioned folks like yourself as well as to the police officers. Those models are very different and they need to be. I'm a firearms instructor. I'm on our regional SWAT team that serves 10 cities, including Redmond. And prior to being a police officer, I was in the Army. I spent about 11 and a half years in the Army, 10 plus as a Green Beret. I bring that up because my time in the Special Forces has given me a perspective that is both offensive and defensive, which I think helps when assessing and preparing for these kinds of incidents. So here's my objective. I want to help prepare you to just be a little bit better survived, or a little bit better prepared to survive an instance like this. The mindset that needs to be developed to survive and thrive and win in something like this really has to be cultivated and worked on. It doesn't happen automatically. And then lastly, I want to share some ideas. I always learn things from the audience during these presentations, and I hope you do as well. So I'm looking forward to that exchange. So we're going to start with a recap of some stats. I know that screen is pretty small. Well, that one's not. So the FBI keeps very detailed statistics about mass killings. What they consider a mass killing is 3 or more people in a single incident. And this data is from 2000 to 2019. I think the laser pointer will be difficult to see. But in the bottom lower right pie chart, I want you to kind of focus on that. That's a couple things I want to highlight. So the largest blue portion right there is shooters apprehended by police, and then the next largest section is the green portion, which is shooters killed by police. And that's not to glorify the action. I just want to kind of make a point of this is not Uvalde, and what you saw occur in Uvalde, I would argue, is statistically infrequent. Most of the time, the cops are doing what they're supposed to do, and the data shows it. So it's hard doing presentations like that in the aftermath of what happened in Uvalde, but I feel like this is a good illustration right there. Another thing that I want to bring to your attention, again, I know the print is small, I'm sorry. So the locations where these events take place, so the largest one by far is businesses open to pedestrian traffic, and I would say that this kind of fits that bill. So the fourth most, businesses close to pedestrian traffic. You guys are sort of blended, where the lobby is sometimes open to the public, but then there is some access control getting up to the higher floors. School shootings always receive the majority of the press, as they should. Our children are our most precious resources, and they're defenseless oftentimes, so I get that. But statistically, it's not where these events are most likely to occur, and that's important when you're preparing for these things. The other one, second highest, if you can't read the text, is open spaces. So concert venues, festivals, parks, things of that nature. And then, unfortunately, as we go later in the study, you can see that the incidents aren't getting fewer, they're growing in frequency. So which is why you're all here, essentially. So some of the common myths is it won't happen here. I promise there's going to be another one soon, unfortunately. I can say that pretty much all the time now, which sucks, but it's true. If you're watching news coverage of the incident, if you're paying attention and they're interviewing witnesses or family members or whatever, you'll hear several people say, we never thought this would happen here. And that's important because almost never is there early warning that these things are going to occur. So for instance, like say when the city of Redmond is having an event like Derby Days, they'll have the Fusion Center work up a threat assessment. And almost always they'll be like, here are the groups in the area that could cause problems, but we have no known threats, right? And that's helpful information, but at the same time, I like to take that time to remind people to stay vigilant, because there's almost never any advance notice that something like this is going to occur. So all those people that said it'll never happen here, everybody always thinks that. So we take the stance of acknowledgement versus pretending something can't exist or won't happen. Attackers fit a specific profile. According to the FBI, that's not true, other than almost always male. You are starting to see, in the last couple of years, more female shooters than attackers. I'm going to get a drink and then kind of clarify that. I'll use the term shooter, attacker, intruder sort of interchangeably, and that's why the class is titled the way it is. Just to be more all-encompassing of the type of events that occur. I think typically most people are thinking like active shooter events, but you do have people attacking with edged weapons and blades. You have ramming attacks into crowds and things of that nature. So a lot of these principles can essentially apply throughout. And then one of the last myths is that the public is helpless. I think that's a limitation of a lot of the active shooter training, or whatever you want to call the training, is not focusing on what the people that are directly involved in the incident can do to help themselves and the people they care about. Because that's a big part of what we're going to be talking about is, heaven forbid you find yourself inside something like this, you are going to be there for some time before anybody is coming to help. I promise we are coming to help, but again, you're going to have to look at yourself as your own first responder initially. And I think if you do, your chances of survival drastically increase. But we'll talk a lot about buying time and creating space and distance between the attacker, and that's really important. So moving forward, as I already hit on, we like to take the stance of acknowledging that this is possible instead of the kind of the ostrich effect where we put our heads in the sand and act like this could never happen here. Oftentimes when I'm giving the presentation, I'll ask people, I'm like, well, do you guys conduct fire drills? And they'll say, of course. We have to. It's a matter of policy or regulations or laws. Ask about earthquake drills. Maybe not so much around here, but like if you grew up in California in schools, this is something that's regularly done. But when you ask them about active shooter events or drills, typically people won't have done anything, and if they do anything at all, it'll be some form of a lockdown, right? Which isn't terrible. It's a good starting point. It's just not a standalone response, and we'll build on that going through the presentation. It's better than nothing, but typically if people do anything at all, that's what I hear. And then no single response plan is going to be appropriate for every incident. The variables that occur, there's always similarities, of course, but the variables that could occur, where, who, and when, are almost infinite. So it's really difficult to say, this is what you should do, and this is why, specifically. And I know that's frustrating if you're an administrator or if you're somebody that's responsible for designing a response plan, because you really want somebody to say, this is what you need to do. But the problem is I don't know how your event would unfold, and I don't know who would be involved, and I don't know where. So it's really difficult to give you specifics like that. So it's better to have a set of principles that are flexible that can be applied to a lot of different things, and that's what we're going to use today. Phased approach, this helps me to kind of organize both what to do when you're inside the incident as well as like our preparation. And preparation is almost everything. Each phase has critical tasks, and any proper response plan is going to be looking at critical tasks for each of those phases. We're going to start with before the incident. So preparation is everything. excuse me, what I encourage people to do, no matter where you work, no matter where you go to church, no matter where recreational stuff, is be familiar with your space. The more familiar you are with your space, the better just the more options become available to you, right? So there's a decent chance that some people in this room know one way in and one way out of this building. There's a decent chance that some people in this room know one way home, and they take that way every time. The more you kind of branch out from your typical routines, the more options that you'll have available to you in crisis. And that part's important. A good way that I can illustrate this, when I was still in the military and we would travel prior to a deployment, a small group of us would go to whatever country we were going to do kind of like a survey, essentially. Assess threats and figure out where things were that we needed to know where they were at. But one of the things that one of the senior guys on my team taught me was anytime we checked into a hotel, we always physically walked from where our rooms were through the emergency exit until we were standing outside. And it sounds simple. It's kind of like whatever, it's not really worth it. But that's kind of Murphy's Law, right? Because it seems like when you don't make the effort to do those things and you just assume, well, the emergency exit sign's that way, I'm just going to go. That's when somebody will have stored furniture that they're getting rid of in the stairwell. That's where when you get to the bottom of the stairs, you'll have two doors. And one might lead back into the lobby and one might lead outside, right? You don't want, when it really matters, you don't want it to be the first time that you're learning these things, right? And so this is all kind of your advanced preparation where you're learning your space. You're paying attention to where the windows are. You're paying attention to where the exits are in the building. You know where the elevators are. You know how they work. You know when they don't work. Again, just the more familiarity you have with your space, the more options that you have. Sounds simple, but most people don't apply this, and you're not just going to figure it out in the moment. That's kind of a reoccurring theme. So one thing that people think is that you're just going to rise to the occasion under stress or something like that, and that's not true scientifically. There's a couple of phenoms out there, but typically you're just going to fall to your level of training or preparation. So if you haven't done any training or preparation, you've got a long ways to fall. So let's keep that in mind. Evaluate your people. Again, I give this presentation to a lot of audiences. So some buildings are just better set up to fortify into lockdown. Some are really easy to get out of because there's exits frequently placed throughout the building. Some people are responsible for little children where running away can almost be as problematic as staying put. Some people have people with disabilities that are not as mobile as other people. So another reason why we need principals. Our situations are all different, but you need to know kind of what you're working with and the people that you're responsible with. And then you can kind of cater your approach to there. Pre-staging useful items. I just give a couple of examples for this, but it's really your imagination is your only limitation here. Working in a school recently, some of the things we talked about, the teacher told me it was going to be difficult for her to run away because she had little children that she was responsible for, and they weren't all that close to an exit. So what her plan was as part of an augmented lockdown was she was going to take a large bookcase and put it in front of the door because the door opened inward into the classroom. Great idea, right? The problem is it was all the way across the room. So sounds good, but she wasn't the Hulk. It wasn't going to be super easy for her to pick up this bookcase full of books and Hulk it over in front of the door, right? But looking at her space, she had a place right there by the door where this didn't look conspicuous. It wasn't that big of a deal. And now she only needed to move this bookcase a couple of feet to accomplish what she needed to. And it was a much more realistic, plan than what she had before. Some of the other things we talked about. It was a ground floor, so she had something to break the window with if she needed to. It's important you know where that's at. You don't want it buried in a file cabinet under, in some kind of bottom drawer. Like, you need to know where that stuff is, and it needs to be readily available, both as part of your evacuation plan and also as potential weapons of opportunity. We'll talk about that later. That's another thing. One of the things we talked about is she had a big rug in the center of her classroom, mostly for the kids to just play on and sit down on when she was reading to them. But I showed her it could be I'm sure everybody's seen a broken window before. Almost always in the window frame you have jagged shards of glass and things like that are remaining. So we talked about how she could lay that over the windowsill so people, trying to escape through the window wouldn't get any more cut up than they needed to. So that was specific to her situation, right? But that's not really the point. When you start looking at the things that you think might help you in fortifying your location or helping you get away or helping you defend yourself, make sure that stuff's readily available and you've thought through that, right? Again, I'm sure all of you have needed something, even if it's just the power going out in the middle of the night and you meant to have the flashlight or candles or whatever in your nightstand and you don't, and you're now filling your way through the house to try and find a light. It's the same concept, right? The preparation goes a long way. And then establishing some type of notification plan. Again, you're only limited by what you can come up with here. One of the things we'll talk about is once the event starts, you're not going to be able to come up with some kind of plan to notify everybody. It's too late. So whether that's using a PA system, IMs, emails, texts, walkie-talkies, whistles, screaming down the hallway, I don't really care. We have an obligation to let as many people know that this is occurring as possible, I think, right? And again, if there's been some forethought into this, I think it's much more likely to be effective opposed to just like figuring it out in the moment. And I know you work at a lot of different shops, a lot of different departments, so again, everything's different for everybody, but consider what you have available to you and then kind of build out from there. So situational awareness, this is a huge part of our preparation. So this is Cooper's color codes, or Cooper's color code of awareness. This has been around a long time. Kind of the reason why he developed this is that old common adage that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So when we're looking over here on the left, where the white rectangle is, it's right where that seam is, but that says unaware or tuned out. On the far end of it, on the black side, you have panic and frozen. The goal is to never be in any one of those things, right? So the white that's the person walking through the crosswalk, texting with their headphones in, and they're playing Frogger and they don't even know it, right? They wouldn't know danger was behind them if it walked behind them for 10 blocks, like with a baseball bat over their head, right? So you don't ever want to be, that's not how you want to live your life, I would argue. And it's not just about violence, right? It could be being a defensive driver. It could be noticing a kid or a grandkid running towards the street. It's just being aware and being a little more present in the moment and not allowing yourself to check out. Yellow is where I argue people should live their lives. Because you don't need to be hyper-vigilant, right? You don't need to be Jason Bourne memorizing license plates that you walk by and looking for everybody's concealed weapons and stuff. It's cooler if you do, but you don't have to, right? But this will become automatic if you practice it. Just because of my professions, I've been doing this my whole adult life. You won't even realize that you're doing it if you put some practice in it, right? And it's really just paying more attention than you probably typically do when you're out and about in your daily lives or with your families. So, because you don't want to spend a ton of time in the orange area, that means you've recognized that something is going wrong at this point. So as far as like stress and arousal goes, that's building. The red means you're actively in conflict, you're taking action, you're trying to get away. Spending too much time in the orange and the red is exhausting. You can't live in that hypervigilant state for long. You'll just be so exhausted and tired of it that you won't care anymore, and you'll find yourself back in the white. But the yellow position is sustainable. People find themselves in the panic or frozen portion of the scale, often because they are surprised by danger or terrible things that they could have recognized were coming. So I don't think it's hard to make sense of if you have a little bit of foresight that something bad is about to happen versus it gets sprung on you all of a sudden. All of us are going to respond better, whether you're highly trained or have no training at all, right? So that vigilance goes a long way to help keeping us out of the panic or frozen section, and that's why police and military training should be difficult. It should be stressful because you're trying to desensitize people to those things. So you can still function as you're teetering on the edge of the red into the black there. But again, this isn't specific to active shooter events. I would say this is specific to life. You will probably be better off in a lot of ways living in the yellow. So we talked about during the incident. Or no, I'm sorry, now we're shifting to during the incident. One of the things that has to happen is you've got to call 911 immediately. There's this kind of weird phenomenon where everybody else just assumes somebody did it. But don't do that. Call 911 even if you think somebody else has. I told you we're coming, and I promised we were coming. But the sooner you can start help coming this way, the better. What are the things you want to report? So description, anything you know about the attackers, where they're at, what are they doing, do they have weapons, are there people that are injured, and then that last one, identity, that's just where it gets kind of creepy. Statistically, with all violent crime, to include these incidents, you're more likely to know your attacker than not, right? And that's all violent crime, that's not just active shooter incidents, so eyeball the people left and right? I'm just kidding. That's a real thing, though. I say that kind of as a joke. But if you had that information and you could get it to the dispatchers who could then get it to the police, hugely valuable, especially if they can push out photographs and things like that we can use. So, and really those 5 or 6 things that are up there, that's essentially reporting any crime. If you're reporting any crime, calling 911, those are the things that the dispatchers want to know, and those are the things the police officers want to know. Location is probably the most important initially, and if you've ever called 911, they want to know where you're at first, because even if you drop the call or if you're no longer able to explain what's going on, at least we know where to start looking or to start searching, right? So location is important, essentially. So notify as many affected people as possible. I mentioned any method that you want to do that's going to let people know. The one thing is, though, so whether it's for this type of thing or it's, even FEMA has come out against using like coded terms and descriptions, right? Because you guys might know I don't know what I usually use, like a code silver banana split means, right? But I would argue that probably half of your coworkers don't remember what that means. So some obscure code that you have talked about maybe once or twice a year is probably not going to be super effective. The other thing, we almost always have visitors in our spaces, whether it's clients, citizens, interns, whatever. If you're in hospitals or whatever, you have patients, things like that, right? So using plain language is a much better way to inform everybody that's present that might not know like what your code system or something like that works. So, and it's hard to go wrong with plain language. So nobody's pulling out handbooks and trying to be like, what does that mean again? Our primary objective is to create time and distance from the attacker. We're gonna, both in whether we decide to lock down, if we decide to try and get away, or if we're forced to, if we have to fight, we're really kind of building on this concept of creating time and distance, because if you called 911, help is coming, I promise. But you're still probably gonna have to buy some time until we can get here. One of the other things about calling 911 is that the dispatchers might put you on hold, but don't hang up, because there's only so many working at once, and they've got to triage all these calls that are coming in. So they're trying to go through the calls and figure out who has the most useful information at the time. It might be you, but they might not realize it until they get 4 or 5 callers deep, right? So don't hang up, just stay on the line, and they'll probably give you some instructions, but if they hang up on you, they hang up on you. But don't just assume, and don't take that personal. That's just because they're, again, trying to triage something. So, but they may come back to you. What you decide to do ultimately should be based on what you know at the time, and that's part of notifying everybody that's in the space that something's occurring. It's hard to make a good decision about like what is the best course of action when you have very little information to work with. So we're going to continue to build on these concepts. You got to be prepared to do these three things: escape, lock down, fight back. Similar to run, hide, fight. I like escape because it might not just be about running, right? It might be breaking a third floor window and making a grappling hook out of computer extension cords. I don't care, something, right? Just kind of expand your mind into doing whatever it takes to get away. And that might be more than just running away. Locking down is good, it's useful, but it has to be practiced, and there's some training and things that can go into that. I bet if we were to select a few random people in the audience and say, go over here and write down what it means to lock down to you, and then we had them compare answers, we'd see some pretty different things. There'd be some stuff that were the same, but we can't assume that means the same thing to everybody. And again, it should be practiced. And then fighting back. It's not nobody is advocating that you seek out the attacker to incapacitate them or take them out or whatever. This is more where you're forced into this confrontation, and opposed to passively going to your death, I would advocate that you fight back as savagely as possible, as mean as you need to win. And that we'll get into that in a minute. So escape, pretty much any violence, any confrontation, I think this is good advice. If you can get away, just get away. But remember, those opportunities are fleeting. So if you know that you have somebody in one end of the building and you're relatively close to the escape or a fire exit or something like that, I would just suggest getting out of there. Again, those windows where you have the opportunity to run away can close really rapidly, and you might not ever get that opportunity back. So think about that. If you have an opportunity to escape or distance yourself from conflict, period, you just should. Be prepared to cause property damage. So it's funny, you can tell who are the managers and stuff in the room typically when I start talking about these things. You need to make sure that this is for real, obviously, right? And no false alarms and pranks and things like that. But in seriousness, if you find yourself in one of these situations, no property is worth your life, right? Or the lives of the people you care about or the people you're responsible for. So you need to be prepared to do whatever it takes to get away. And things like, I mentioned smashing windows frequently. It might be smashing through some drywall or something like that, which is relatively easy to do if you're going through the studs, because while your room doesn't have an emergency exit, maybe the room next to you does. Or at least if you can get to the next room, you can get to a stairwell or something like that. That also builds off what we were talking about, like how familiar you are with your space, totally, right? But don't be afraid to cause property damage. This sounds kind of silly, but people almost need to be given permission to do things like this, because we're a civilized society, we follow rules, we follow the laws, we do what we're supposed to, right? But oftentimes those sort of artificial restrictions kind of hang over people. And I've seen this training newer police officers where one incident in particular stands out in my mind where this young officer stopped, 2 or 3 blocks from where they needed to get because there was cars blocking their way. But had they driven up on the sidewalk and over a little bit of grass, they could have bypassed it and got right where they needed and not had to run several blocks, right? And talking about it afterwards, they told me, well, we don't drive on the sidewalk. I was like, you're right, we typically don't. So typically people don't think about, some of you do, I know you're probably experts at I'll drive anywhere you need. Where's the hammer, right? I'll break anything you need, I'll go anywhere you need me to go. Not everybody needs to be told that, but for those that are out there, some people are just rule followers, and that's just how they are, and that's fine. They need to be empowered to do what they need to do to save themselves and help each other. Familiar with your space, more escape routes. I can't beat that. I can't hit that point enough. So, I apologize. I am still fighting some allergies today. Lockdown is a good start, but it's not a standalone option. The first thing that you really need to know what to do is if your doors swing inward or outward. So inward doors are pretty easy. You basically just need to find anything that is heavy or causes serious friction that'll prevent the door from coming open. We could spend a whole day just talking about locking down, right? But again, property damage is all free game, right? So that's stacking anything you can find in the room, anything that's heavy, anything that'll form a wedge under the door. You know, like just your basic wedge door hold, they're like used to hold doors open. On the other side of a push door will make that dang near impossible to open unless you destroy that door. Simple things like that. Even rolled up rugs on top of other carpet can create a lot of friction and make that surprisingly difficult. It doesn't have to be high tech, but you should always start with your simplest options, like use common sense, use your door locks, right? Commercial doors are surprisingly difficult to break down. On the SWAT team, we spend a considerable amount of time and effort trying to break walls and doors. Commercial doors are pretty difficult, and one of the things that Hollywood and video games have kind of given people the wrong impression on is it's not easy to shoot doors down. You can shoot holes in doors, that's fine, and you can try and shoot locks with guns. It's not as easy as it looks, and it's not that efficient. It also takes time and ammunition, which is good for you when you're trying to create time and space until the police can get there, right? And we'll talk about that more in a minute. But sure, I mean, this is not a good room to lock down, right? So which one of you is going to cover up the glass? You're getting right on that, right? Right, yeah. So use common sense, right? Some are easier than others, but the push doors, make sure you know how to basically stop the door from swinging inward. Doors that open outwardly are a little more tricky, but I've seen some really smart, like kind of like on-the-go ideas that people have came up with. One of the things that I saw was taking like a heavy-duty extension cord. You know, have the male plug, which is fatter than the actual cord itself. So like sticking that out in the hallway, closing the door, and then pulling the cord through. So now you have, it's like a knot on the end of a rope. Then taking that extension cord and anchoring it to something heavy inside the room, right? You can use belts to tie them around door handles to, again, pull them tight against something and anchor it against something heavy. If there's nothing to tie it to, you can get out of the way of the door and basically play tug-of-war with them, right? Because one of the things I want you to think about is, how much time do these people really want to spend messing around with one door? So when I think about our typical attacker, right, a lot of them have these weird fantasies. They want the next highest body count, right? That's what they're going for. They want the notoriety. They want to be in the news, and they want to create a body count. So in their twisted little delusions, they are picturing nobody fighting back, no locked doors, and just crowds of people that they can just shoot into without any resistance, right? That's what they're anticipating. So now, if every door they come to is going to be a major endeavor to get through, that is good for you, because that's frustrating our opponent. If they're choosing to shoot through it, there's potential danger for us, sure, but they're not likely shooting us. It's going to take time. And again, if they know the police are coming, so again, how much time do they really want to spend on any one given door? And if every door they go to is continuing to frustrate them because everybody is doing similar concepts, that's exactly what we need from you. One last one that I saw that was pretty clever is just using some cordage. I think they used essentially like charging cords and things like that from laptops. But they got a small folding table, turned it horizontal that's actually wider than the door, and then tied it to the actual door handle. So the only way you'd get that door open is somehow forcing that other rectangle through the other rectangle. Again, without destroying stuff, it's not going to happen. The specifics don't matter. It's just to show you like how creative people can be, and it's really not that hard to make it really hard to get in places. Going forward with lockdown, so we refer to basically anywhere inside the doorway. A common term that you'd hear in the military and tactical world is the door is a fatal funnel. So typically, if people are going to when the door opens and people are going to shoot, they're going to shoot towards the doorway, right? If they're the kind of people that are going to shoot blindly, they're going to do when the doorway opens towards the door. So we want to limit as much as possible. We don't want to be in front of the doors. So if you are in some type of lockdown situation and they do decide to start shooting through the doors, you don't want to be anywhere near that door. Try and get as far away from it as you can in the room. Yes, bullets will shoot through walls too, but again, how much time and ammunition do they want to spend just shooting at some random wall of a room that they don't know is occupied? One of the things that I kind of glossed over, but making things look uninhabited, right? So a room that has the lights off, the blinds drawn, and the doors are locked. Again, how much time, if it's kind of weird to do, but if you put yourself in the attacker's place, how much time are you going to spend messing around with that door? I don't think very much. So, oh, there we go. There we go. I knew I had it in here somewhere. So lockdowns are potential traps too. You have to recognize that. If you are locked down and you allow your assailant to get in your space, you've essentially trapped yourself. So sometimes that's unavoidable, sometimes it's worth the risk, but it's worth discussing. In a perfect world, you would have a way out, right? Like the room that you're locking down isn't like a corner with one way in and one way out. But life is imperfect, and that might be what you have. So just recognize that if your lockdown space is penetrated by your attacker, the only thing left you have to do is fight, or you're going to basically passively go to your death. Lockdowns must be practiced. I'm sure I mentioned something that was maybe a little bit new to somebody in the room, right? Just to kind of illustrate the point where just saying lockdown is not simply enough. Obviously, there's a lot more city employees that work for the city of Redmond that are in this room, and you guys are just a fraction, right, that have heard this information. So we can't just assume that everybody knows what it means to lock down. So, fighting back. We view this as a last resort. It would be foolish, and I'm not advocating for you to leave some place of relative safety to seek out your attacker and whatever, incapacitate them. But it's just not how I'm wired, and I understand that's not for everybody. Some people just view themselves or they're pacifists, and that's okay. I'm not trying to change your mind. Some people are just not willing to be violent. They don't believe in violence, and they're not going to practice violence, and that's fine. I'm not here to change your mind. For the people though that are on the fence, you're more who I'm trying to reach, because if you haven't ever thought about something like that, you're better off at least mentally walking through some of those things than just before they potentially happen, than just assuming that you're going to be Jason Bourne when it happens. Find weapons of opportunity. Just about anything can be a weapon of opportunity if you're creative enough. Your chances improve with numbers. I'm not saying that if you try to dogpile an attacker that somebody wouldn't get hurt or killed, but there's that adage, right, that he can't get us all kind of thing, right? So when I used to teach another program, one of the exercises that we would do to illustrate this that was kind of cool was we would ask somebody in the audience, who wants to be the shooter? There's always like one person that's like, and you're always like, ugh. Anyway. So we'd give that person a Nerf gun, tell them to go out in the hallway. They don't hear anything else. Everybody else in the audience, we'd give them like a rubber plastic ball that you'd see in like a McDonald's like ball pit, right? I tell the audience, hey, when your shooter comes in, I want you to throw your ball at the shooter. That's all I want you to do. And then we go back out in the hallway, tell your shooter, hey, go into the room and try and shoot as many people as you can with your Nerf gun. So really funny to see how quickly your shooter gets put on his heels. He opens the door, thinks he's going to shoot a bunch of sheep sitting here in their seats with his Nerf gun, and everybody starts chucking McDonald's balls at him, right? Especially because they're not expecting it, and it's not even violent, it doesn't hurt. It almost completely overwhelms them initially. It doesn't last forever. And it's a pretty good way to illustrate it. Like, they're not expecting to meet that kind of resistance. They're more likely to choose this building than the police department because they know we're armed, right? They're more likely to choose a school than a military base for those same reasons. They're not looking for a fight, right? They're looking for easy violence. So if you guys are willing to immediately kind of turn the tide and return that violence their way, it's a good chance you can get them on their heels. The point is, obviously, you guys should all start carrying McDonald's balls around, right? No, not at all, right? But it's just to show you that it doesn't take much to regain some initiative to, at that point, if We got the attacker on the hills. We got a pretty good chance if we've got enough people willing to make a move on them. And we sometimes say on the other side of the building, pig pile instead of dog pile, but that doesn't really matter. But dog pile your assailant and gain control of them, right? There's a lot of safety in numbers. We want to overwhelm them until they're captured or incapacitated. And then the other thing, too, is whether you are finding yourself in a situation where you're deciding to run or fight, do something. Because I've been carrying guns my whole adult life, and I can tell you that shooting at moving targets is incredibly challenging. Movies, TV shows, all that stuff, video games, it's doable, but it is very difficult. And these are not people typically that have a lot of training and experience with weapons, right? So sitting still, you are much easier to shoot than you are moving. So do something. One of the kind of horrible, gruesome details that came out of the Virginia Tech shooting was the shooter essentially walked down the aisles of desks and was just shooting kids that were sitting underneath the desks, right? Not their fault. They'd done exactly what they'd been told to do. In a lockdown situation, they were supposed to get under their desks and wait for further instructions. But he essentially just walked right down the aisle, and I don't remember how many of them were shot in that particular way, but it was pretty dang disturbing, right? And again, it's not their fault. That's what they'd known. But it is in your best interest to be mobile. I would hope that's to be trying to maneuver on your suspect to try and get them. But even if it's to try and get away, do something. Resist the urge to just freeze and do nothing, right? Talk about after the incident. So these are difficult to plan for. I think this is the phase that's most difficult to plan for because you have no idea how this is going to unfold. You don't know where it's going to happen, when, who it's going to affect. But some of the things you can be thinking about is how we're going to gain accountability. It starts if you know, or it helps if you know how many people you're responsible for before something like this happens, not after. So making sure you know that information is pretty helpful. Reunification, that's typically more something that occurs in school shootings where the school's evacuated and the students and faculty go to one location, and then it's like a coordinated reunification with their loved ones. But law enforcement and fire department will typically handle something like that or be heavily involved. And then lastly, some type of healing, depending on the level of trauma that people are exposed to. Anticipate people needing some help to get through that stuff. So police arrival. So the big one is don't be armed. Like, this is my nightmare. You guys did exactly what I said. You dogpile your attacker. You hog tie them with extension cords and belts. And then somebody is standing there with their foot on his back, holding their gun for a picture or whatever. I'm just kidding. But the point is you're armed, right? Don't be armed. Even if you're carrying and you're responsible, that's awesome. Just don't be armed when the cops get there. So it is, it's an overused expression, but I think it applies in these situations, like this concept of fog of war. The amount of information that gets flooded into a police department and a communication center during an event like this is staggering. And I would say confidently, half of it is wrong or just not true. So the dispatchers are doing the best they can to communicate this information to the officers. But if you think about our city in particular, it might be able to get some of it clarified before we arrive, but probably not. But Kirkland, Bellevue, King County, Mercer Island, State Patrol, Duval, whoever, State Patrol, there will be hundreds of cops that come to something like this. And we don't talk on the same air with them. So there's a telephone game that has to occur. Our dispatchers need to call their dispatchers and share information, and everybody knows information gets distorted or lost in those situations. So all that to say, what the officers are going to know responding is largely going to be not true. One of the things that always happens initially is reports of multiple shooters. And don't quote me on this, I think there's only, like in the last 20 years, like 3 incidents of more than one shooter. It's incredibly rare. But what happens is you have people doing what I told you to do, call 911, giving slightly different descriptions at different phases of the incident. And it creates this picture that this place is just swarming with shooters, right? So All of this, just so you know, the police are not going to have very good information when they come, so don't be armed. Even if you did something incredibly heroic and got rid of this knucklehead, don't be armed. If you do take their weapons away from them, one of the things, whether if you can conceal it if you really think you need it in case there's somebody else that could hurt you, okay. Just make sure it's not in your hands and it's concealed and you're vocal about it. If that's not the case, find a corner, put it in the corner and put a trash can upside down on it and have somebody sit on it, right? Just so it's controlled, we know where it's at, and it's not threatening to anybody. Easier said than done, but try to stay calm. One of my favorite sayings is, calm is contagious, but so is panic. I'm going to cough again, sorry. Allergies are getting me. If you are freaking the F out, the people around you are going to be freaking out. If you can find it in you some way to be that calming presence, I promise it will have a calming effect on everybody around you. Again, easier said than done. I've recognized nobody's immune to this. I remember we were pursuing some armed robbery suspects from Redmond into Seattle on 520. And the officer who was up front was the one typically communicating with the rest of us. He sounded like he was driving to, we weren't going that fast, Mayor. But the suspects were very serious crime. They'd robbed a guy, 3 of them at gunpoint. But they were going like 120 miles an hour across 520. And he sounded like, I can't even, like, his level of like, yeah, we're doing this and blah, blah, blah. And I remember like distinctly like loosening my grip on my steering wheel. Nobody's immune to that, right? It had a calming effect on everybody that's involved. If you can be that person, everybody will be better off, to include the cops, right? So try to be, not easy to do, but something to work towards. Follow commands because of all those things I said about the bad information. Nobody knows that you're the good guy, per se. So just try not to be difficult. Again, expect officers coming from all over the place that don't know you, that don't know the city, that don't know this building, that have even less information than the Redmond cops. Just try to at least go with the program as much as you can, and don't create any unnecessary friction, unless you have critical information about the shooter or people that need immediate medical attention. That's something worth getting people's attention over. What are the police priorities? Most of you probably heard this before, but it's important to recognize. So the initial officers that get here, if there's people still being harmed, that has to be the sole priority. You have to find the shooter and you have to do something about that. You have to either capture him or kill him, right? It makes no sense to start performing first aid on people that you're coming across in the lobby if there's people being shot down the hallway. We're prolonging the event. And that wouldn't be easy for officers to do, to bypass hurt people. And it dang sure wouldn't be easy for people laying on the ground that want help, right? But you got to understand that the priorities matter depending on where we're at in this event. And you have to eliminate the violence first, right? That's got to be contained. After that, you should shift quickly to stop the dying. You'll hear a common concept in this model is a rescue task force. And that's where you have members of the fire department being escorted by the police department in to either treat casualties or to evacuate them. It's a really good model. The problem is it takes time. Because again, we've got to basically establish a unified command. We've got to get on the same page, figure out where we're going, where the casualties are. It doesn't happen in just a couple of seconds, right? That takes time. So the next slide is super important when it comes to some basic first aid stuff, but no, that is our priority. After the violence is done, the priority should immediately shift to first aid, evacuations, things of that nature. But then it's everything else. So those are the only 2 things that matter at once. There's going to be other things that matter to you, and I totally get that, and it would to anybody, but that's not what's going to matter to the police. Those are the only two things they should care about initially. So if we're doing our jobs correctly. So this is kind of a new addition to the class or the presentation. But Stop the Bleed is a very cool organization. I'm sure some of you are familiar with it. But bottom line is, if you want to save people's lives in something like this, Knowing how to stop major bleeding is probably more important than knowing how to perform a rear naked choke or shoot somebody. The chances of you absolutely should be willing to defend yourself and protect yourself and protect your loved ones and the people you're responsible for, don't get me wrong. But the last stats I saw, I think it's the people, generally speaking, the people that are going to bleed to death in something like this is inside 4 minutes. I can tell you that those rescue task forces that I talked about with the police department and the fire department working together probably aren't going to be operational inside of 4 minutes. So when I talk about you being your own first responder, this is one of the things I'm talking about. And it doesn't actually have to be that complicated, but knowing how to stop major bleeding, right? That's what's going to kill people long before, you know, somebody experiencing heart problems, somebody that is short of breath or something like that. It's major bleeding, especially arterial bleeding. So Stop the Org is a really cool organization. They sell trauma bags and kits that you'll see like placed in compartments not all that different from like an AED or something in your building. They also host training that is geared towards people that don't do it all the time and would like to learn more, but it's pretty cool. Strongly encourage it. It's also just good life skills. On more than one occasion, I've used my medical training from the military and as a police officer not working, right? Could be you coming across a bad crash. It could just be an accident at work, like some kind of equipment malfunction or somebody doing something stupid with equipment. Could be anything, right? But having a little bit of basic, or I would go beyond basic first aid. Primarily, I'm talking about the ability to control bleeding. That's what's going to kill people fastest, is huge. And it's definitely worth your time and maybe a little bit of money. So I think we're done. That's it. We're going to do a little bit of Q&A, if anybody has any questions.